19th century is largely identified as the Victorian era, signifying Queen Victoria's reign over the UK from 1837 until 1901. The UK is important to the formation of the clothing style of the time, as Queen Victoria had an extreme focus on fashion when she was thrust into the public scene and had to care about her image. This contributed greatly to the woman she influenced throughout her reign. Like most women of the time, she dressed to please the men in her life. In the beginning of her reign, her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, advised her on everything, even what to wear. Later on in her life, her husband, Prince Albert, assumed the same role. Fashion in the early 1800s included white hats, which were very popular at the time. Also, clothing began to have more ornate trim, like feathers and lace. Shawls were often worn as well, which continued to be in style for most of the century. Hooded overcoats were worn over evening dresses for events and parties. Hair often looked like masses of curls, sometimes pulled back into a bun. Women now often wore soft, shuttle, sheer, classical drapes and shawls. Dresses tended to have a raised back and a high waist. The style of the time moved to a more risque type that went along with the expanding gender role of women. Bare bosoms and arms were common. The hairstyle of the decade would be parted in the center with tight ringlets over the ears. In the 1820s, dress waistlines began to drop, and hem and neckline decorations became more and more elaborate. Skirts tended to be cone-shaped, and sleeves were pinched. In the 1830s, sleeves became increasingly en gigot, meaning they had the shape of a mutton leg. Gowns were low in the waist and, if worn for the day, were often adorned with a belt and buckle or sash tie. Skirts were ankle-length and scantily trimmed. Also, hairstyles started to become more elaborate. The 1840s contained a trend of low shoulders and a low-pointed waist, along with bell-shaped skirts that grew throughout the decade. Evening dresses were often off the shoulder. Hair was often parted in the center with ringlets at the side of the head, or styled with loops around the ears and pulled into a bun at the back of the head. Paisley or lace shawls were fashionable accessories, as were linen caps with lace frills for indoor wear and large bonnets for outdoors. Also, capes with large collars were fashionable. In the 1850s, women's skirts were domed and bell-shaped with crinoline petticoats underneath. They often featured large flounces or tiers. Long bloomers and pantaloons trimmed with lace were popular to wear underneath dresses. Bonnets were worn and hair was generally parted in the center. The 1860s women's dress featured tight bodices with high necks and button fronts. White lace was popular for collars and cuffs, as were low sloping shoulders that flared out into wide sleeves. The skirt continued to be full and bell-shaped until around 1865, when the volume moved its emphasis towards the back of the skirt with decorations. Hair was worn with a center parting tied into low chignons at the nape of the neck. 1870s women's fashion placed an emphasis on the back of the skirt, like in the late 60s, with long trains and fabric draped up into bustles with flounces and ruching. The waist was lower in the 1870s than in the 1860s, with an elongated tight bodice, and the skirts had more of a flat front. Hair was dressed high at the back with complicated twists and rolls, falling to the shoulders adorned with ribbons, bands, or decorative combs. The 1880s women's clothing, considered fashionable, featured tightly fitting bodices with a very narrow sleeve and high necklines, often trimmed with white frills or lace. At the beginning of the decade, the emphasis was placed at the back of the skirt, featuring ruching, flouncing, and embellishments such as bows and big fabrics and trims. The middle of the decade saw a brief revival of the bustle, which was so exaggerated that the back of the dress protruded horizontally from the small of the back, but by the end of the decade, the bustle had disappeared. Also in the 1880s, the healthy corset was introduced. This design was less overstructed and constricting, and they were ready to wear for different body types. Hair was worn in tight, close curls on the top of the head. In the early part of this decade, women wore tight bodices with high collars and narrow sleeves, much as they had done in the previous decade. Around 1893, however, sleeves started expanding back into an engigot shape, which was tight at the lower arm and puffed out at the upper arm. Skirts were generally just a simple A-line. Masculine styles and tailoring were increasingly popular, and women sometimes wore a shirt collar and tie, particularly when playing golf or going out walking. Hats in this decade were small or wide with lots of trimming, but generally worn squarely on top of the head.